Hey guys, tonight we're slipping barefoot into a kitchen that doesn't have a floor, just dirt, sweat, and the faint aroma of something burning. You wake up before the sun, your nose already filled with the sacred scent of wood smoke and roasted maize. Your bed is a woven reed mat stretched on hardened clay. You're a royal cook in a Maya temple city, which means you haven't had a proper night's sleep since the last eclipse. Good news, you're alive. Bad news, so are the gods. And they're hungry. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your eyes adjust to the half-light of dawn. Your body aches from being curled like a salted fish. Every bone reminding you that sleeping on dirt never gets better. It just gets familiar. Your tunic, which you've worn for the past 6 days, is damp again. Humidity is not an event here. It's a lifestyle. You shuffle toward the doorway of your tiny reed hut behind the temple kitchens. Outside, the city is stirring. You hear the rhythmic scraping of other cooks, grinding maize on stone methods, a song of effort and inevitability. You join them because you must, because today is another feast day. And by feast, we don't mean cake and candles. We mean roasted iguana, ceremonial tamales, and a quantity of cacao large enough to make even a god jittery. You drag the firewood from the damp pile, praying the termites haven't eaten too much. You build a smoky blaze in the outdoor hearth and hang your cooking stones over it. The air is already thick, not just with smoke, but with anxiety. Today's feast is for the high priest again, which means no mistakes, which means you might cry into the masa. Again, breakfast isn't just food here, it's ritual, obligation, and performance art. You kneel on the hard ground, grinding kernels until your fingers blister, your knees, numb since the third solstice of last year. Make a sound when you stand that could qualify as percussion, but you don't complain. Complaints are for nobles. Cooks simply chew on their thoughts like old tortilla ends. You pass by the temple facade, stone carved with jaguar gods, rain deities, and enough snakes to make Indiana Jones cancel his holiday. Inside, the elite are waking to fragrant steam bowls of spicy atole. Prepared before the sun even stretched, you prepare it all. But you'll eat a cold, bland version hours later. Maybe while crouched behind the pantry shrine. The city stirs in layers. Merchants arrange their goods. Priests chant under their breath. Warriors sharpen their obsidian blades. And you dice chili with the intensity of a monk reciting scripture. Because one bad seed, and the high priest might see visions you did not intend. Historians still argue whether royal cooks had spiritual status or were just highly respected servants. Either way, you're somewhere between indispensable and invisible. Your job isn't just to cook. It's to divine the divine menu. The gods are picky. The nobles are pickier. And your stomach gave up hope 3 festivals ago. You stir the stew slowly, watching the steam rise in patterns that might be read as omens, if only you had the luxury to read anything but the blister on your hand. Today will be long. There will be sweat, spice, smoke, and exactly 5 minutes to eat whatever didn't burn or escape. But for now, the day has begun, and you're still standing. There's a difference between waking up early and never having gone to bed properly in the first place. You, unfortunately, know this difference intimately. It's still dim outside when you kneel beside your fire pit again, coaxing reluctant embers to life with breath that smells like burnt maize and regret. You had maybe 2 hours of rural sleep, just enough time to remember the face of your mother, who was also a cook, and just enough time to develop a backache that feels biblical. Your sleeping quarters are less quarters and more corner. A narrow thatched lean-to built behind the main temple kitchen, where the smoke always drifts, no matter where you lie. The roof leaks in 5 specific places you now know by heart. And the reed mat you sleep on has started to unravel. There are no pillows, just bundles of cloth, if you're lucky, and even those smell like chili oil and desperation. No privacy either. Your roommate, if you can call the old man who sleeps 2 feet away a roommate, mumbles spells in his sleep, possibly real ones. You haven't had the nerve to ask, and the junior cooks trample by you every morning with all the grace of baby jaguars on fire. You sit up slowly. The first pop of your knee sounds like a cracked cacao pod. The second, a small cry from your soul. Outside. The city is waking again, but temple kitchens never really sleep. You toss aside your mat and push through the flap of woven reeds that serves as your door. No hinges, no locks, no sense of security, just a breeze and the unmistakable stench of something fermenting. You pass the morning with your usual task, scraping char from yesterday's clay pots, sweeping ash into a pile you'll probably reuse, and trying to avoid the one chicken that hates you specifically. The gods require order. The kitchens require miracles. You provide both, sometimes in the same hour. Your official duty is to serve the high priest's meals and oversee the hot food offerings during public rituals. This means constant cleanliness. Accept surprise, you live in a climate where everything molds in under 3 minutes. You try to keep your hands clean, but water is fetched in pots from a nearby cenote, and the pot smells like old tamales. So does the water. You wash anyway. Sleep deprivation is not a side effect of the job. It's the essence of it. Historians still argue whether Maya temple cooks were permitted midday naps. You wouldn't know. No one's offered you a nap since your 3rd naming ceremony. Every now and then, your body tries to revolt, a wobble in your knees, a twitch in your eye, a hallucination of your bed that turns out to be a squash. But you soldier on, because the food must be ready. It must be hot. It must be sacred. And if it's not, well, there's always the cenote. Your morning break, if it arrives, is a sliver of coal atoll and a piece of overcooked maize bread. It tastes like ash. Not in a poetic way, but because ash actually fell into it, you chew without tasting. Because you've stopped expecting joy from food that you make, but are never meant to savor. One of the temple runners passes by and drops a list carved on a thin bark scroll. The nobles are requesting turtle stew again. You sigh. You haven't seen a turtle in weeks. You might need to get creative. Again. The sun rises reluctantly through the canopy. Its light hits your temple apron and reveals yesterday's grease stains, which have merged into a single continent of culinary shame. You'll scrub it later, by which we mean you'll rinse it and whisper an apology. There's no time for bathing, no time for real rest, no time for dreams. Just fire, just food, just fatigue stitched into your muscles like sacred thread. The temple compound is breathtaking at sunrise, stone pyramids, casting long shadows over perfectly aligned courtyards. Birds calling from the jungle edge. Incense already curling in lazy streams from the priest's altar. But none of this beauty matters right now, because you have to go to the toilet. And in a Maya temple city, being a royal cook doesn't come with the luxury of a private latrine. It comes with a clay pot, a shared one, tucked behind a low wall near the compost pile. You call it the sacred chamber of shame. It's unventilated, unceremonial, and extremely unholy. There is no toilet paper. Of course, you got your pick of dried maize husks, smooth river stones if you're lucky, or on a good day, a scrap of worn cloth that's been passed around more times than the ceremonial cacao spoon. Historians still argue whether the Maya elite had access to more refined toilet habits. But one thing is certain: you're not elite. You tiptoe to the latrine zone, carefully avoiding the slick moss that has claimed the northern stair. You pass a jaguar statue. Its open mouth seems to mock you. A leaf brushes your arm, and you jump like you've just stepped on a scorpion. There are rumors that one of the assistant priests fell into the compost pit and had to be fished out with a paddle. You don't want to be the next cautionary tale. The actual act is a balance between shame, speed, and strategic breathing. You perch on the clay seat like a nervous squirrel, doing your business while swatting away flies and praying that the old stone doesn't crack. There's no lock on the wall flap, just a piece of twine you loop hopefully over a nail. You make eye contact with a passing cook, and both of you pretend it didn't happen. You try to avoid breathing through your nose, but the air is thick with a scent of fermentation, old urine, and something you're scared to identify. The compost pile nearby has its own culture. You suspect it may be alive. A fringe theory among temple acolytes is that the pile can move, just slightly, during the night. And when you're done, you do not flush. You carefully cover the pot with a flat stone. Sprinkle it with ash or lime if available, and then hope a junior runner comes to empty it before the sun gets too high. If not, the pot will greet you again tomorrow, just a little fuller and significantly angrier. The temple's public latrine is worse. Technically a large pit with a wooden frame, a partial screen of hanging vines, and enough foot traffic to qualify as a market stall. Going there is like attending a small, silent festival of shame. Everyone knows why you're there. Everyone hears the results. One priest jokes that it's a sacred offering to the gods of digestion. You don't laugh anymore. And no, there is no plumbing, no miracle aqueduct, no discreet sanitation system, just gravity, buckets, and hope. Disease spreads like gossip fast, sticky and indiscriminate. You've heard that one of the junior dancers once caught a skin infection just from sitting too long. You believe it. Bathing isn't an option after the ordeal. That's saved for ceremonial days or after major sacrifices. Instead, you rub your hands with coarse salt and a bit of lime peel. It stings. You pretend it's a blessing. You stagger back to the kitchen, your dignity in tatters, your spirit slightly broken, your stomach somehow still functioning. The gods may demand incense, music, and blood, but even they can't save you from the toilet situation in a Maya temple city. You resume chopping coyote like nothing happened. You stir the pot of tamale dough as if your soul isn't crying. Welcome to survival. The good news, you're a royal cook. The bad news, you don't get to eat like one. You return to the kitchen with the unmistakable scent of wood smoke and fermented corn already thick in the air. Fires are burning low in stone hearths. Steam rises from clay pots. And you get to prepare food for the gods, the nobles, the priests, and then maybe lick the bowl if no one sees. Let's begin with breakfast. Not for you, heavens. No, for the high priest. His morning meal includes fresh ground maize tamales wrapped in banana leaves, stuffed with mashed black beans or pumpkin seeds. If he's in a good mood, he might request a drizzle of wild honey or even cacao shavings. You mash, fold, steam, and sweat, and then serve. Your meal, a broken tamale from the corner of the fire pit, no filling, half burnt. Congratulations. Historians still argue whether cooks were allowed regular meals or if they simply scavenged leftovers. You've stopped wondering. You eat when you can standing up, dodging hot coals, and trying not to be noticed. Midday is worse, because it's ceremonial feast time. You work with at least 5 other cooks in a half-enclosed stone kitchen. It's not glamorous. The air is hot enough to cook your eyelids. Smoke curls in lazy waves around your face. The ground is slick with masa. There's a bowl of squash seeds fermenting behind your feet and something unidentifiable bubbling in the corner. You've been instructed not to ask. You pound maize into dough, slice jungle fruits, and grind chili until your hands sting and your nose runs. You mix up a sacred stew chelity using a toasted cacao, ground maize, chili, and a hint of vanilla orchid. It smells divine. You stir it with a carved stick that looks suspiciously like a reused ritual tool. You do not ask questions. Now comes the meat. And by meat, we mean iguana, maybe turkey if it's a feast day, or manatee if the high priest has been exceptionally pleased with the latest solar alignment. You clean the carcass, you boil bones into stock, you roast, wrap, and serve, then watch it disappear. You don't get any. Unless a noble child complains it's too chewy and pushes it aside. That's your shot. You dart in, swipe the reject, and chew like a raccoon under the moon. Sometimes, a junior acolyte takes pity and shares a bite of fresh tortilla. Once, someone smuggled you a spoonful of mashed sweet potato. You nearly cried. There is one comfort, the communal drink. At least once a day, someone brews up a pot of atoll a warm. Thick drink made of cornmeal, water, and sometimes cacao. It tastes like drinkable porridge with a hint of ash and someone else's elbow sweat. But it's warm, and it fills your stomach just enough to stop the angry bubbling. Spoiled food. Let's just say the 5-second rule becomes the 5-minute rule if no one's looking. You've eaten stew with ants in it. You've eaten maize cakes dropped on stone. You've eaten something green and gelatinous that may have once been squash or possibly frog. You don't choose the food. The food chooses you, and sometimes it chooses to kill you. The sacred dining hall is silent as the priests eat. You crouch near the fire, trying to ignore your stomach's theatrical complaints. The head cook slaps your hand if you reach for an extra tortilla scrap. You nod. You whisper thanks to the gods. You chew quietly, because tomorrow, you might be lucky enough to taste the fruit core. Or you might just be the one who stirs the sacred stew and watches your dinner float away in someone else's bowl. You start the day smelling like smoke, maize dough, and yesterday's sweat. By midday, you've added chili oil, ground turkey feathers, and something that might be fermented pineapple. And by sundown, your outfit could file a formal complaint against your existence. Let's talk about your clothes. First, don't get excited. You don't have a wardrobe. You have a piece of cloth, singular, a woven cotton tunic, maybe knee length if you're lucky, dyed with faded indigo and stained with a century's worth of kitchen crimes. Royal cooks are theoretically prestigious, but no one is investing in your fashion choices. You are, essentially, a mobile napkin. That tunic, it absorbs everything. Hot grease splatters. It catches them. Squished fruit pulp from the high priest's morning smoothie. Permanent ashes from the fire pit embedded in the threads like ancestral curses. You can't wash it. There's a water shortage. Besides, clean clothes are for nobles, not the guy stirring iguana soup. Historians still argue whether temple cooks were allowed regular laundry privileges. But if today's itchiness is anything to go by, you'd bet on no underneath. You wear a simple loincloth. It's there for modesty, technically, but when it's soaked through with atole and banana juice, modesty is the least of your concerns. You walk around feeling like a soggy tortilla folded the wrong way. Shoes? Ha, you must be new. You got sandals made of woven plant fiber. They don't so much protect your feet as an ounce. This person gave up. The kitchen floor is slippery. The outer steps are jagged. Your toes are seasoned veterans of stubbed disasters. And the bugs. Oh, the bugs. There's a myth that sacred temple kitchens are free of vermin because of ritual purity. Reality check. You once saw a beetle crawl out of a ceremonial stew pot. You made eye contact. It didn't flinch. Your clothes don't keep the insects out. In fact, they seem to invite them in. Mosquitoes love your sweaty calves. Fleas treat your ankles like a hostel. There's a wasp nest under the woodpile. You've made peace with it. Bathing helps on the rare days you're allowed. But the moment you dry off and pull the tunic back on, the illusion of cleanliness vanishes like a noble's promises. You're back to being the temple's human sponge, your hair tied up with string. If you're smart, otherwise it soaks in the humidity, takes on a life of its own, and occasionally gets dipped into sacred stew. You once served a priest a strand by accident. He didn't notice. You cried a little, sometimes. A high priest's assistant passes by wearing bright red feathers, gold-trimmed robes, and a headdress taller than your self-worth. You look down at your crusty tunic and think, I too am part of the ceremony. Then you trip over your sandal and land face first in chili paste. Still, clothing has its hierarchy. The royal guards have jaguar pelts. The priestesses wear embroidered gowns with jade beads. You've got a patch over your armpit and a dream. There's one fringe benefit. Though, when your tunic gets so stiff from layered food stains that it stands up by itself, you can take a break and pretend it's a fellow worker. You chat with it. It never judges. And when you finally collapse on your mat at night sweaty, stained, and smelling like 3 different stews, it's the only thing you have to wrap around yourself. That. And your undying hope that one day someone invents fabric softener. You open your mouth to yawn and immediately regret it. Something in there stabs you. Could be a fragment of yesterday's toasted maize shell. Could be a piece of obsidian. Could be your own tooth, dislodged and now freelancing. The Maya elite get jade inlays and fancy dental filing. You get pain that echoes through your skull like a drum solo in a cenote. Let's be honest, dental hygiene is a myth, a concept, a luxury item like gold headdresses or private bloodletting rituals. You clean your teeth the same way you clean a grinding stone with friction, spit, and luck. Some people chew fiber sticks like licorice root or chicle sap for cleansing. But let's not pretend chewing gum is going to solve your rotting molar. And that molar is probably cracked. You bit into a half-charred turtle egg last week and felt something shift. Not emotionally, physically. It's been throbbing ever since. You try to ignore it during your shifts. But every time you yell, "More cacao," your jaw locks like a ceremonial trapdoor. Historians still argue whether Maya cooks had access to temple healers, but it likely depends on how recently you fed a noble, and whether they're still alive. If you're lucky, the shaman might offer you a herbal poultice. If you're not, they might try smoking the pain out using chili-laced incense. The last guy who tried that hasn't spoken since. One time, an apprentice suggested using obsidian tweezers to pluck out the offending tooth. You told him if he touched your face with sharp rock, you'd season his soul. He believed you. There's no mouthwash. Your best option is to swirl warm corned beer and hope it kills something bacteria. Nerves, dignity, it usually just numbs your tongue. For about 5 minutes, then it's back to business as usual, swampy breath, bleeding gums, and vague shame. And the breath, oh, it's a symphony. Layers of onion, ash, uncooked cacao, and centuries of oral trauma. You once whispered near a temple guard and he flinched. Now he calls you Eclipse Mouth. There are no mirrors. You only know something's wrong when children stop playing near you, or when a priest mumbles an offering to the gods in your direction. That's Maya, for please cleanse this cursed spirit. You've lost 3 teeth in the past year. One fell out while biting into roasted plantain. Another cracked during a ceremonial yam roast. The third, you swallowed it accidentally and now refer to it as your internal jewelry. Some elite women intentionally file their teeth into pointed shapes status symbols meant to dazzle. You have accidental jagged edges that slice your tongue in your sleep. At this point, your mouth is less oral cavity and more historical site of ongoing erosion. Archaeologists will one day examine your skull and say, "Ah, yes, this person lived hard, chewed harder, and definitely died cranky." One fringe belief says rubbing chili peppers on your gums cures inflammation. You tried it once. You transcended your body and briefly communed with the sun god. Never again. Even speaking is a calculated risk. You try to limit conversation to single-word salt. Done. Ow. Longer phrases just give your teeth more time to betray you. You dream of a world with soft bread, warm soup, and dentists who don't double as exorcists. But here, in this limestone kitchen soaked with sweat and smoke, your reality is crunchy everything and prayers whispered through broken molars. Still, you carry on, because someone has to stir the tamale pot. Someone has to bite test the fish eyeballs. Someone has to suffer for the royal palate. And that someone, tragically, is still you. Your spine doesn't bend anymore. It creaks. You wake before the sun, when the temple's shadow still blankets the earth like a warning. You're not late. You're already behind. The fire pits need stoking. The maize needs grinding. And someone decided the king requires 5 breakfast options today, because apparently, omnipotent rulers get indecisive too. You stretch your arms and feel resistance. Right. That's yesterday's soreness making a comeback tour. Your fingers are blistered from husking. Your forearms scorched from lifting stone lids off steam pits. You're a cook. Yes. But only in the way a brick is a wall completely consumed by the structure. Essential, but anonymous. The labor isn't poetic. No scenes of you elegantly slicing avocado under moonlight. It's you, squatting for hours over a 3-stone hearth, inhaling more smoke than oxygen while turning tortillas by hand until your fingerprints wear off. And then you get to climb. Because, of course, the noble dining chamber isn't next to the kitchen. It's at the top of a godforsaken pyramid. You climb 91 steps carrying hot stone bowls wrapped in banana leaves while praying not to trip, and create the world's least majestic food delivery disaster. Historians still argue whether royal cooks were seen as artisans or servants. You know the answer. You are absolutely, undeniably both. Celebrated for your skill right until you burn the jaguar meat or forget to offer tamales in multiples of 4, a sacred number. Then you're just that smoky person who disappointed the gods. And yes, there's a kitchen team, but don't imagine friendly camaraderie. There's the older cook who thinks your atoll is too thin, the apprentice who once spilled chili into the dessert mix, and the herbalist who insists that every dish should include crushed cacao shells for texture. You're part chef, part mediator, part unpaid therapist. Did we mention you're not paid because you're not? You serve the temple. The reward is honor, spiritual proximity, and maybe a portion of yesterday's leftovers if the nobles don't finish their fermented honey cakes. Meanwhile, your feet, flat from standing, burned from hot coals, calloused from walking between the kitchen pit, the smokehouse, the grinding room, the spice mortar, and the ceremonial platters that must be polished with obsidian dust so the gods will approve. You dream of weekends. They don't exist. Festivals. You're the reason they happen. You prepare food for other people to feast, laugh, dance, and vomit ceremonially into clay bowls. There's no such thing as off-duty. Last night, you were awoken to prepare a midnight offering of grilled quail. For a dream the high priest had. About an owl. That's it. Just an owl. Children in the temple compound aren't immune to work either. You saw a 7-year-old tasked with counting cacao beans for ceremonial brew. He made it to 11 before falling asleep on the basket. You left him there. He deserved the nap. The tool's primitive. You grind with stone on stone. You stir with wood in pots big enough to trap nightmares. Your body is your machinery. And unlike obsidian knives or clay bowls, no one replaces it when it cracks. A fringe belief claims cooks absorb the soul of every animal they prepare. If true, you're currently part jaguar, part turkey, and part crab. No wonder you feel constantly torn in several directions. Still, when the plates are laid out, and the priests nod approvingly, there's a moment brief, sacred when you believe you exist, that your labor means something, that your sweat-fed tortillas bridge heaven and earth. Then someone sneezes on the offering and you have to remake the entire spread. You don't scream, you just start again, because you are the cook, the hearth, the silent backbone of divinity, heat. It hits you like a slap the moment you step outside the temple kitchen. Not the gentle warmth of a spring sun, but the kind of punishing heat that makes you question your life choices, your past lives, and the color black. You are in a Maya temple city, which means architecture is impressive, engineering is advanced, and yet somehow no one has invented the concept of shade. The plazas are vast. The stones reflect heat like angry mirrors. The ceremonial stairs radiate like toasters. And the white plaster walls, they glow like the sun's evil cousins. You tie a damp rag around your neck. It's mostly for hope. Inside the kitchen, it's worse. Not just hot, but heavy. Fire pits, steam pots, chili smoke, and bodies. Dozens of them. Packed into a space with no ventilation, because smoke rising to the gods is symbolic and apparently non-negotiable. Your skin never dries. Your hair sticks to your face. You now sweat in places you didn't know had sweat glands. And let's not forget the flies drawn by both the scent of roasting iguana and the salt buffet dripping off your arms. Historians still argue whether Maya kitchens had designated cooling zones or airflow tunnels. Spoiler alert, you've never seen one, or if they existed, they were likely reserved for actual gods, or perhaps the high priest's dog. And summer isn't even the worst, because then comes the rainy season. You might think, oh, good, cool or air. Wrong. The humidity turns your cotton tunic into a second skin, and your sandals into fungal experiments. The floor becomes a muddy slip and slide, where even standing still is a challenge. You spend most of the day balancing clay vessels on your head, navigating puddles that could hide snakes, and trying not to scream when lightning cracks near the cornfields. You're not scared of being struck. You're scared it'll ruin the guacamole and someone will blame you. Your living quarters, a hut that leaks from 3 corners, it's like camping in a wet towel. You've tried patching the roof with banana leaves. Bark. Prayer. The rain always wins. Clothes you own, 1 tunic. It's beige-ish. Or it was. Now it's permanently chili-stained, vaguely damp, and stiff in all the wrong places. No laundry machines. Of course. No drying racks. You clean it by waving it near incense smoke and hoping the gods forgive the smell. Sleep is a myth. Nights are either sweltering, filled with mosquito choirs, or freezing. Because jungle climate logic is dictated by chaos, you lie awake on your mat, one leg outside the blanket to regulate your temperature, the other inside to avoid scorpions. You long for seasons. Not the Maya seasons of dry and drenched, but real ones, with jackets and mittens and the blessed promise of indoor heating. Instead, you get eternal summer, peppered with flash floods and the occasional temple bonfire that accidentally roasts a bystander. A fringe belief says the sun is a god, chasing prey across the sky. You relate. You feel chased too by heat, sweat, expectations, deadlines. But unlike the sun, you don't get to set. When it gets too unbearable, you sit under the cacao trees. It's the closest thing to a break. Watching shadows twitch across the roots and hoping no one finds you for 5 minutes. Then someone yells, something's burning, something's boiling, or someone important just walked in and wants their roasted iguana tender but not soft. And so, you rise half-baked, fully soaked, spiritually wilted, and shuffle back toward the temple steps. The stone burns your feet. The air presses against your lungs. The sky threatens thunder again. But you don't flinch, because you're a royal cook. And heat is your least dangerous problem. It begins with a drop. Just one. From the corner of a stone gutter above your head, landing with a soft, ominous plop in the clay water jar beside your sleeping mat. You don't flinch. You don't sit up. You've trained for this. The rain is coming. Again. And that means it's time to think about water. You'd think that in a temple city built beside sacred reservoirs and seasonal rivers, clean water wouldn't be your biggest threat. But you'd be adorably wrong. The truth is, in your world, water is less a symbol of life and more of a gamble, like drinking from a sacred slot machine where the jackpot is cholera. You fetch your drinking water from a cenote, a massive natural sinkhole believed to be a portal to the gods, which is poetic, until you realize it's also the neighborhood's communal bath, laundry site, and occasional site for sacrifices. Not metaphorical ones, literal ones, human ones. Historians still argue whether the Maya boiled drinking water regularly or trusted the gods to purify it. Either way, your intestines have become test subjects in that debate. And so far, the results are explosive. But the alternative isn't great either. Rainwater collection jars breed mosquitoes like it's a sponsored event. And filtering through cloth doesn't exactly scream science-backed sanitation. So you do what everyone else does. Drink cautiously. Chew bitter herbs to clean the blood. And pray you don't wake up with your stomach tying itself into ritual knots. Bathing. That's a whole saga. You're expected to remain ritually clean in the service of the temple kitchen, which is hilarious. Because clean here means scrubbing yourself with sand and river silt, then standing under a trickle of cold water while jungle insects host a potluck on your back. Soap doesn't exist. Not the fragrant, bubbly kind. You've got tree bark. You've got crushed lime. You've got raw determination. You once tried mixing all three and ended up smelling like fermented citrus and shame. Worse, bathing too often is considered risky. There's a belief that clean skin opens the pores, inviting illness inside like a bad party guest. So while you're sweating 12 hours a day in a room filled with smoke, boiling maize, and fire, your hygiene instructions are basically don't tempt fate by washing too much. Oh, and by the way, public latrines don't exist. Your options include jungle privacy spoiler, there's none. Chamber pots, you empty into communal pits. Or squatting behind temple walls while pretending you're just admiring the architecture. Toilets, in short, are a social experiment and often a small public event. Toothbrushing. Huh, you're lucky if your teeth haven't simply left by now. The combination of maize-heavy diet, sandy grinding stones, and constant grit means your molars are more fossils than tools. There are chew sticks made from aromatic twigs, but they mostly serve to mask breath that could wither a cacao pod. Worms, you've got them. Everyone's got them. It's a given. They're basically honorary citizens. You eat them, you drink them, you live with them. And when the real danger comes, when fever kicks in, when vomiting won't stop, when your eyes blur and your joints swell, your only cure is a healer with carved bone needles, stingray spines, and a little packet of hallucinogenic leaves. You chew, you sweat, you cry, you maybe survive. Sometimes the gods get their sacrifice after all. And yet, through it all, you endure, you stir the idol, you wash the gourds, you lift heavy water jars from the cenote, even though your knees crack like corn tortillas every time you stand. Because water, in your world, is both sacred and deadly. It feeds the maize. It feeds the people. It feeds the city. And occasionally, it tries to kill you. And now the fires are low. The last pot is scrubbed. And you finally sit. Not because you have time, but because you have nothing left. The sky outside rumbles faintly. Rain falls in steady rhythm, drumming on palm. Thatch like fingers tapping you toward sleep. The scent of smoke still clings to your hair. Your skin is sticky with heat and work and memory. But you don't mind now. You've made it, not triumphantly, not unscathed, but quietly, like the end of a breath. You lean back against the temple wall, legs aching, stomach oddly calm. There's nothing left to do tonight. No more orders. No more sacred dishes. No more battles with the water. Just the hush of a sleeping city. The rustle of trees in the dark. The slow, steady pull of dreams. So close your eyes, if only for a while. Tomorrow will bring heat and hunger and hymns. But tonight, you rest. Now, we step softly into the candlelight of medieval wedding halls, where lace and leather meet dead livestock and legally binding soup. You would never think that till death do us part might include holding a freshly slain goose at the altar, but welcome to matrimony in the Middle Ages. Here, love isn't just blind, it's also blood-stained, muddy, and occasionally feathered. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing where in the world we're all falling asleep together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle into a hall that smells like sweat, spice, and damp hay. The groom stands near the altar, gripping a very dead goose like it's a bouquet. In parts of medieval Germany, this wasn't a prank, it was a tradition. The groom presents the bird to the bride's family, symbolizing wealth, luck, and fertility, which is adorable if you ignore the cold, limp feet dangling toward the wedding cake. The idea was that the goose, fattened and ready, would nourish the household a living well, formerly living symbol of prosperity. But the deeper symbolism, some historians suggest it was a reminder that marriage is both a feast and a sacrifice. Romantic. Others point out that in pre-Christian rites, animals were often linked to spiritual union, so perhaps this was less about dinner and more about warding off evil spirits. Or maybe it was just showing off your poultry game. Historians still argue whether the goose was symbolic, practical, or just a really unfortunate guest of honor. Of course, this isn't the only creature showing up at medieval weddings uninvited. Dogs were sometimes present not as pets, but as wedding gifts, loyalty tokens, or metaphors for obedience. A medieval French lord once offered a dog and a barrel of mead as his entire dowry, somewhere between a pet and a bribe. And dead animal accessories didn't stop at geese in some Norse-influenced areas. The groom would wear a belt made from a wolf's pelt, or tuck a fox skull into his sash. A fashion statement and a message: I'm strong enough to kill this. Now let's get married. You stare at the altar again. The goose's neck droops like it's asleep. The bride doesn't flinch. Maybe she's used to it. Maybe she's just hoping for a live cow next time. But the real kicker, the dead goose was sometimes later boiled and served at the wedding banquet. Yes, your husband's love offering becomes dinner. Nothing says romance like carving up your own dowry. In a world where love and survival were often tangled, a dead goose might have been the best case scenario. It didn't yell. It didn't ask for land. It didn't bring debts. And it sure didn't drink all the ale. You wake up the morning after the goose-filled celebration, hoping things can't get any weirder, Spoiler, they can. Because now you're heading into a tradition where the guests don't just toast the bride and groom, they chase them, grab them, and in some places, literally carry them to bed. Welcome to the post-wedding ritual of bedding ceremonies, where privacy goes to die and social discomfort reaches peak medieval in many parts of medieval Europe. Once the vows were said, the bedding began. Not the romantic kind, more like a half-public ceremony where the bride and groom are led or dragged to the marital bed while an entire village watches. Why? Well, in a time when alliances were made and fortunes were exchanged with a kiss and a contract, it wasn't enough to say you were married. You had to prove it, or at least act like you were going to. In England and France, the bedding ceremony was part theater, part legal checkbox. Guests would gather around the couple's bed, sing lewd songs, toss nuts and fruit because fertility, and then leave them alone eventually. Sort of. Sometimes. There were guards outside the door. Or worse, witnesses. Don't worry, usually just audible ones. The legal term for this consummation, the emotional term, absolutely not. One fringe tidbit in parts of Scandinavia. The bedding was sometimes preceded by mock resistance. The bride would pretend to run, and the groom's friends would capture her and carry her to the bedroom, while laughing like this was all very normal. Which, in a way, it was. Historians still argue whether this was a symbolic transition from girlhood to marriage or just a wildly inappropriate party trick that got out of hand. But even in more conservative regions, the newlyweds weren't guaranteed peace in some German towns. The wedding guests would literally bounce on the marital bed before the couple got in it. Why? Allegedly to warm it up, or to bless the bed, or maybe just to make sure it didn't collapse during the actual, part. You might be wondering, wasn't this embarrassing? Absolutely. But it was also legal insurance. If the marriage wasn't consummated, the whole thing could be annulled, money refunded. Alliances broken, future children deemed illegitimate. So yes, the stakes were high, and the goose dinner was just the opening act. And if you didn't go through the bedding ceremony, people noticed. People gossiped. A medieval noble once canceled an alliance because the bride refused to be bedded in view of witnesses. Apparently, her modesty outweighed her dowry. Her family disagreed. Modern wedding nights involve champagne? Maybe a hotel. Possibly Netflix. But in 1250, you got lukewarm ale, a group of in-laws outside your door, and a feather-stuffed mattress that smelled like wet goat. Nothing says happily ever after like performance anxiety and shouting uncles. And the next morning, you were expected to look radiant, rested, and slightly smug, or at least not visibly traumatized. The bedding ceremony might have ended, but the performance, that was just beginning. Just when you thought the wedding could finally wind down after the fish tossing, the bed warming, and the is this even legal nudging, you discover the real fun starts with breakfast. Not your breakfast. The communities, because in some medieval cultures, waking up married meant it was time to bathe together, publicly, with commentary. Let's go east. In certain regions of India, especially among tribal and early medieval communities, post-wedding rituals sometimes involve the couple sharing a symbolic bath. Yes, with an audience. Imagine being elbow deep in turmeric-scented water while your relatives critique your bathing technique. This wasn't just a quick rinse, it was a purifying act, meant to spiritually cleanse the bride and groom before starting married life, of course. The spiritual part becomes blurry when your aunt brings snacks and your cousin brings binoculars. In other areas, the newlyweds didn't even get to bathe alone. Helpers, usually women from both families, would literally scrub the couple. On the surface, it was symbolic unity. In practice, a medieval spa day with aggressive loofahs and zero personal boundaries. One fringe tidbit from Tamil traditions mentions brides having to balance clay pots while being bathed as a test of grace. Historians still argue whether this was a test of poise or just a ploy to keep her from running. Meanwhile, back in Scandinavia, a Norse bride might face a different ordeal hair combing. Doesn't sound bad. Let's reframe that. It's your wedding morning. You've barely slept. Your scalp is still sticky from sweat and flower garlands. Now, 10 women surround you with combs made of bone and seashells, chanting about fertility while yanking your tangles like they're exorcising demons. But nothing compares to the bizarre custom found in parts of medieval Eastern Europe, where newlyweds were paraded around holding spoons and pots, symbolizing the cooking of future generations. If it sounds confusing, it's because it is. You're expected to smile while clutching kitchenware, swearing allegiance to your in-laws' stew recipes, and possibly reenacting food prep rituals, a literal stir of romance and domestic labor. Of course, there were gifts, but not the blender or wine glasses you might expect in some Slavic regions. The groom was gifted a belt and a whip. No, not that kind. Symbolic kind meant to represent leadership in the household. Charming, the bride often a sieve or butter churn. Yes. Her gift was a dairy appliance, symbolic of whatever men thought marriage was back then. The irony, despite all this pageantry, the couple had little say in it. This was less about personal love and more about community investment. Your wedding was a group project. You weren't just marrying each other. You were marrying your entire town's expectations, opinions, and bathing techniques. And as the sun rose higher and the turmeric clung to your eyebrows like ceremonial Velcro, you realized the truth. This wasn't a honeymoon. It was a festival of endurance, of awkward symbolism, of matching pots and broken combs. Good news, you're legally hitched. Bad news, your scalp's on fire, or your relatives are still watching. And someone just asked when the real fun starts. Just as you're wiping the last bit of turmeric from your ear canal and wondering if marriage always includes so many root vegetables, someone hands you a cup. It smells earthy, not unpleasant, but very specific. You're told to drink it. You ask what it is. They say it's for fertility. You drink anyway because refusal is impolite, and you've already been bathed by strangers today. Welcome to the world of medieval wedding beverages and culinary tests, where meals weren't meals, they were omens, tests, and emotional performances served on questionable pottery. In many medieval Chinese customs, the bride and groom would partake in cross-cupped wine, a formal gesture where they drink wine while entwining arms. Romantic, sure, until you realize it's sticky rice wine. The mugs are slippery, and 50 relatives are watching like it's the final round of a reality show. Spill a drop. It's bad luck. Don't drink enough. Someone whispers, you're doomed to childlessness. No pressure. Then there's the bizarre but entirely real tradition in parts of Northern Europe where the couple would eat bread made with peculiar ingredients. One Icelandic record describes a loaf flavored with sheep's fat and ash. Historians still argue whether this was symbolic or just a convenient way to recycle failed bonfires. Either way, your wedding cake has never felt more intimidating. Over in medieval Germany, there was the wedding sausage, a literal yard-long sausage paraded like a relic, meant to represent the prosperity and fertility of the union. It was then ceremonially sliced by the bride with her new husband's dagger. Try not to read into that metaphor too much. In certain Indian communities, a playful yet slightly traumatizing ritual called Juta Chupai emerged where the bride's sisters steal the groom's shoes and ransom them back for cash. While this is mostly lighthearted now, some scholars believe it originated from older symbolic acts of disempowering the groom until he proves his worth. You just want your shoes back. They want a dowry in rupees. Meanwhile, French peasants sometimes forced newlyweds to drink the chamber pot toast. Yes, it's as bad as it sounds. After the wedding feast, the couple would be surprised with a bowl containing leftovers from dinner, plus hair, garlic, and occasionally the scent of human waste. The couple had to drink from it as a symbolic gesture of tasting life's bitterness together. Modern couples complain about cold buffet food. You've just been hazed by the village latrine. And then, of course, there's the gift of raw eggs. In parts of Eastern Europe, couples were handed eggs to break together. If both eggs broke cleanly, joy. If one cracked oddly mild, misfortune. If one was rotten, consider therapy. Historians still argue whether this was rooted in pre-Christian fertility rites or just people finding new ways to weaponize breakfast. The common thread, food and drink, weren't just nourishment. They were theatrical, emotional landmines. To eat was to perform. To drink was to commit. And to survive dinner without vomiting or offending a distant cousin, that was true marital harmony. So you sip, nibble, wince, and smile. You say thank you for the sausage. You ignore the flavor of ash. You negotiate for your shoes like a hostage negotiator. And just when you think the ordeal is over, someone rolls in a second course. Now that the food's gone cold and your dignity is lukewarm at best, it's time for what every medieval wedding guest secretly dreads: the ceremonies. Not the vows, those are usually brief, mumbled, or spoken in Latin no one understands anyway. No, the true horror lies in the symbolic acts, where you, the nervous newlywed, are transformed into a performance artist in front of an audience that may or may not be sober. First, stop Scandinavia, where Norse traditions sometimes require the bride to wrestle a piece of the groom's armor off his body. Romantic? Not really. Symbolic of the merging of two households. Sure. Physically humiliating in front of all your elders while tugging at a metal chest plate. Absolutely. And if you fail, well, you clearly aren't ready for the challenges of marriage. Historians still argue whether this ritual actually existed, or if it's just a medieval exaggeration passed down by a bard with a flair for drama. Over in parts of Eastern Europe, it gets stranger. The bridal slipper ceremony was a thing. The bride's shoe was stolen, passed around, and eventually ransomed back by the highest bidder, often the groom, who had to publicly declare the bride's worth in coins. It's like an awkward eBay auction meets relationship therapy. And yes, sometimes the groom was expected to drink wine from the shoe before returning it, because nothing says commitment like foot-flavored Cabernet. In rural Italy, they took a different approach. During a tradition called serenata, the groom stood outside the bride's home and sang for hours the night before the wedding, often with an accordion and a growing crowd of hecklers. The bride, she watched silently from a window. If she laughed, he was considered charming. If she didn't, well, it might be time to reconsider. This performance-based approval system gave new meaning to sing for your supper. Then there's the money dance. It shows up across cultures: Poland, the Philippines, Nigeria, and more, but in medieval contexts. It had slightly sharper edges. Instead of simply pinning cash to the couple's clothing, guests might throw coins on the floor and watch the bride pick them up with her teeth. This act was part fundraiser, part humiliation, and part medieval entertainment. Your honeymoon fund depended on your flexibility and dental integrity. In some Celtic regions, they went a step further with hand fasting, where the couple's hands were literally tied together with cords during the ceremony. Today, it's quaint. Back then, it was mandatory. Forget cold feet, you couldn't even scratch your nose without your new spouse feeling it too. And while some scholars insist this symbolized unity and trust, others believe it had more to do with making sure nobody ran off mid-vow. Let's not forget the bedding ceremony. You know, the part where the wedding guests escort the couple to their chamber, sometimes singing bawdy songs, and sometimes, yes, helping undress the bride. There are records of entire villages attending this moment, whether for encouragement, supervision, or just sheer nosiness, remains up for scholarly debate. In some parts of England, guests even toss coins onto the bed, shouting blessings or fertility wishes, because nothing gets you in the mood like being pelted with pocket change. So here you are, tied to your spouse, barefoot, possibly wine-stained, surrounded by people shouting jokes in dialects you can't understand, and still expected to look grateful. You survive only by remembering the one universal truth of medieval weddings. It's not about love. It's about spectacle. And you, lucky soul, are the main act. Just when you think the worst is over, after the awkward rituals, the questionable wine, and the unsolicited advice from a cousin with 6 teeth, you realize you've forgotten the most ominous part of the wedding night expectations. And no, you won't be spared just because you're tired or emotionally unwell. In many medieval cultures, the wedding wasn't official until it was consummated, ideally, with an audience. Yes, you would never think that privacy on your wedding night was a luxury, and you'd be absolutely right. Let's start with the public bedding ceremony, which we teased earlier. It wasn't always symbolic. In several European regions, guests accompanied the bride and groom to the bedchamber, sometimes placing them in bed themselves, sometimes lingering just long enough to ensure some movement. There are documented cases in German courts where the marriage was declared null and void if no one could verify that the couple had done the deed. Historians still argue whether these reports were exaggerated for legal convenience, but the mood they leave behind is anything but romantic. In medieval France, it was customary for the priest to bless the marriage bed. Sounds sweet, until you realize the bed was often in a shared home, surrounded by paper-thin walls, or no walls at all. The concept of a honeymoon suite was laughable. You'd be lucky to get a straw mattress that didn't squeak like a tortured duck. And if you thought wedding night anxiety was a modern issue, try performing under pressure while your in-laws wait outside with wine and commentary. Norse culture, ever the overachiever in awkward rituals, sometimes included symbolic sword ceremonies. The groom might plunge a sword into the bride's bedpost, an act meant to show virility, strength, and the deeply uncomfortable blending of martial metaphors with intimacy. Some say the sword stood in for a pagan god's blessing. Others say it was a convenient excuse for stabbing something that wasn't your new wife. Meanwhile, in India's ancient customs, particularly among Rajput nobility, the wedding night involved not passion, but ritual fasting and prayer. The couple was expected to abstain from intimacy for days, sometimes weeks, to cleanse their bodies and souls. You may think that's thoughtful, but imagine being 17, wearing 70 pounds of jewelry, and being told to sleep upright on a ceremonial cot while priests chant about karma and rebirth. That's not marriage, it's a sleep-deprived existential crisis. Let's also not forget the medical implications. In medieval England, if the bride was suspected of not being a virgin or worse, if she didn't bleed, scandal erupted. Cloths were often inspected. Yes, actual pieces of linen were displayed to prove purity. It's the only time in history when blood-stained laundry was cause for celebration. Fringe historians still debate whether these bloody sheets were always real, or whether mothers-in-law just kept emergency supplies for dramatic effect. And just when you think this night can't get any more uncomfortable, enter the concept of marriage debt in many Christian cultures. Husbands and wives were religiously obligated to satisfy each other's needs. Yes, as in needs. Failure to do so wasn't just rude, it was sinful. You could be summoned by church courts for not being enthusiastic enough. Somewhere between penance and pillow talk lies a very confused theology student taking notes. So there you lie, exhausted, maybe bruised, in a room that smells faintly of onions and fear, with your new spouse staring back just as wide-eyed. You thought marriage would bring peace, security, maybe even affection. Instead, it brings damp linens, nosy neighbors, and an awkward story passed down for generations. Congratulations, you are now truly wed. Morning comes, and with it, the next chapter of matrimonial joy, surviving the in-laws, ancient edition. You might think modern family politics are complex, but medieval households had an entirely different game board, one where the stakes were land, cows, and divine judgment. You would never think that your new mother-in-law could legally control your food, clothes, and where you slept. But here we are, in many parts of medieval Europe. Newlyweds didn't start a life in a cozy private cottage. No, they moved straight into the groom's family home, a home he often shared with his parents, siblings, cousins, goats, and the ghost of someone's great uncle. This wasn't just a living arrangement. It was a social hierarchy. The bride came in at the bottom, just above the animals. In fact, if she didn't milk the cow on time, the cow was probably considered more useful. In Scandinavia, the bride was expected to serve her husband's parents immediately, not symbolically, literally. Cooking, cleaning, and yes, even foot washing rituals weren't uncommon. This was supposed to prove humility and readiness for the role of wife. Historians still argue whether these tasks were enforced as hard rules or encouraged through shame, which, let's face it, might be worse. Either way, if you were dreaming of a relaxing day after your wedding, too bad you're elbow deep in root vegetables by dawn. Things weren't better in other regions. In medieval China, Confucian law ensured that a daughter-in-law's obedience to her husband's mother took precedence over any personal preference. If your husband liked spicy soup and his mother didn't, guess who ate bland broth for the rest of her life? And if the family had a dowager grandmother, you were now serving two queens, neither of whom wore a crown, but both of whom had the power to ruin your year. The tension wasn't always unspoken. In parts of Eastern Europe, it was tradition for the bride and mother-in-law to engage in a ritual contest. Sometimes it was about strength, who could knead bread faster. Sometimes it was about wisdom, who could recite the most proverbs. But in most cases, it was about control. The winner got the symbolic keys to the pantry, the loser emotional scarring and probably kitchen duty forever. Let's not forget the glorious tradition of testing your fertility immediately. In numerous cultures, including medieval Islamic societies, a bride was expected to prove she could produce heirs as quickly as possible. The pressure wasn't subtle. In-laws might track menstrual cycles more carefully than a moon priest. If no child appeared after a year or even 6 months, gossip would bloom faster than wild onions in spring. Fringe scholars even claim that in some households, herbs were mixed into food to encourage fertility, though what those herbs actually did is still debated. And heaven help you if you were infertile. Divorce wasn't always allowed, but mistresses were, in noble courts across Persia and France. A woman who didn't produce an heir might find herself politely ignored at best, or completely replaced at worst. That beautiful wedding you endured, it becomes an embarrassing footnote. Your new job is smiling in public, while your replacement does the childbearing. Yay, legacy. And just when you think the worst is over, the gifts start rolling in. Not for you, for your mother-in-law. In some regions, particularly among nobility, the bride was expected to bring extra gifts to the groom's mother silk, spices, livestock as a thank you for allowing her to marry her precious son. It's like a subscription fee for your own marriage, payable in poultry. So here you are, married, exhausted, and suddenly a part-time servant in a home where everyone outranks you. No wonder the medieval marriage vow didn't include happily ever after. It couldn't even promise a hot meal. Just when you've scrubbed the last turnip, survived the family politics, and managed not to weep into your grain porridge, The wedding process throws you one final curveball superstition. Yes. After enduring ritual humiliation and in-law servitude, you now must tiptoe around a minefield of invisible taboos. You would never think that accidentally stepping over a chicken would doom your marriage. But here we are again, in medieval Ireland. It was believed that seeing a hare cross the road on your wedding day meant barrenness. Not bad luck, just a lifetime of quiet stares from Auntie Mabe and suspicious herbal teas. This was the same world where sneezing at the altar was good luck. Unless you were the groom, then it meant you were unfaithful in a past life. Scholars still argue whether these beliefs were widely held or just exaggerated by chroniclers with an appetite for drama. But the sheer volume of records suggests people weren't exactly skipping through fields carefree. Over in the Norse territories, superstitions took a more action-packed form. You didn't just hope for blessings, you fought for them. Brides sometimes carried iron keys under their skirts to ward off evil spirits. Grooms wore wolf teeth as pendants to attract strength and fertility. Picture yourself standing at the altar, clanging with hidden hardware and animal bits like a medieval security system. Romantic, sure. If your idea of romance includes scaring demons and jingling ominously, then there's the bread. Oh, yes, the bread. In many medieval European traditions, a special loaf called the bride's bread was baked not to be eaten, but to be shattered, and not with a knife. Guests would throw the bread at the bride. Why? To ensure fertility, of course. Because nothing says start a family like getting pelted in the face with barley-based projectiles. Historians have yet to agree whether this was symbolic, gently tossed, or full-on dodgeball violence. But we know this: some accounts mention bruises, bread with a side of concussion. Superstitions also dictated where you could look, what you could say, and which foot to use first. In parts of Eastern Europe, stepping into your new home with the right foot brought blessings. The left foot brought scorn. Imagine tripping on your own wedding day and knowing your mother-in-law would blame that stumble for every bad harvest for the next decade. And yes, there were anti-jinx chants rhyming couplets about goats, demons, or smoke behind the veil. You didn't recite them. Enjoy your haunted cradle. Weddings near water brought their own problems. In Slavic areas, it was considered bad luck if the reflection of the bride appeared wobbly in a lake or river, an omen of infidelity or death if it rippled. Elders would demand a second ceremony or perform a ritual blessing involving fire. And if the water was still, but the bride looked too pale, that was worse. It meant your spirit had been stolen. The solution: drinking 3 sips of blessed ale while holding a frog. Yes, a frog, preferably alive. Let's not forget the clothes. Your veil could never touch the ground, or it would tie your womb to the dirt. No, your belt had to be unknotted only by your husband if a child did it. The marriage was considered spiritually void. And shoes, you'd best wear mismatched ones for luck, or else risk walking uneven into the union, a phrase both poetic and deeply unsettling. Some of these superstitions faded, others still echo faintly in modern customs. Throwing rice, for instance, evolved from ancient fertility rituals, but most of the medieval practices have mercifully been retired, preserved only in musty texts and the occasional Renaissance fair reenactment gone wildly off script. So if you're ever tempted to romanticize medieval weddings, remember the frog. Always remember the frog. And just when you thought it couldn't get more uncomfortable than being pelted with bread while holding a frog, we arrive at the glorious post-wedding rituals, because why stop the madness now? In the medieval world, saying I do was merely the opening act. The real fun began after the vows, with family, community, and a whole lot of unrequested participation. You see, in many parts of medieval Europe, especially rural England and Germany, the newlyweds weren't given privacy for the honeymoon. Oh no. They were escorted paraded to the bridal chamber by a conga line of friends, family, and overly curious neighbors, and sometimes livestock. What followed was something called bedding the couple, a ceremony where the happy pair were undressed by others, yes, really, tucked into bed like toddlers, and then serenaded with dirty songs. Historians still argue whether this ritual always included actual consummation or whether it was more symbolic. But either way, you're not getting sleep tonight. Meanwhile, in medieval France and Burgundy, a special drink called hippocras, a warm wine spiced with cinnamon and sugar, was delivered to the bedroom in ornate goblets, not by room service. Of course, by the in-laws, with a straight face. You sip it while sitting in bed with your new spouse, both of you awkwardly pretending the room isn't full of relatives placing bets on how many children you'll have. In Norse traditions, the couple's marriage wasn't considered fully legitimate until the sheets were bloodied, ideally by a broken hymen. But if not, goat's blood would do? Yes, goat's blood. Some families kept a flask of it just in case. A little too red, just call it ceremonial. A little too dry, add water. Because what's more romantic than the constant pressure to provide evidence of intimacy? And if you think India was safe from this insanity, guess again. In several tribal traditions that survived into the early medieval period, there were wedding games meant to ensure compatibility. One involved the bride and groom wrestling each other. First one to pin the other, one command in the relationship. Sweet. Right. Until you remember both sets of parents are watching. And yelling tips? Superstition didn't sleep after the ceremony either. The first item a wife touched after marriage was believed to predict her fate. Touch bread. You'd never go hungry. Touch iron. Your marriage would be strong. Touch the cat. You'd be scorned. In one 13th century German folktale, a bride fainted and her hand brushed her mother-in-law's boot. The villagers declared it a bad omen, and she was forced to wear boots to bed for a year to reverse the curse. You would never think bed boots was a thing, but again, welcome to the Middle Ages. The first fight between a couple was also heavily ritualized in many regions. In some Serbian customs, a staged argument was arranged within a week of the wedding. The goal? To exorcise bad luck by releasing tension early. If it turned into a real fight, even better, it meant passion. If they were too polite, the community might worry the marriage lacked heat. So yes, you're now performing fake marital arguments for the sake of your village's peace of mind. And let's not forget the dreaded bride price inspection. In parts of medieval Africa and South India, the gifts exchanged at the wedding had to be formally approved after the event. If someone decided the goat wasn't fat enough, or the sari too plain, families could demand a rematch another ceremony, more gifts, and more singing. Wedding season was not a metaphor. It was a lifestyle. Eventually, after days of observation, assessment, and awkward public affection, the couple might be left alone. But even then, there were rules: no lighting fires before dawn, no walking outside alone, and certainly no cutting hair for 3 days. Why? Because the spirits might still be lurking. Apparently, your wedding glow also made you ghost bait. So yes, marriage in the medieval world was more than a commitment. It was a community-sponsored endurance test, designed to entertain, control, and occasionally traumatize. You would never think a private promise could become such a public circus. But here we are. And now, so you breathe out. The noise fades, the torches flicker, and finally, the goat is quiet. You picture the candlelight softening, the chants drifting into silence, and the crowd finally stepping back into the shadows. Even the frogs have stopped croaking. There's no more bed-shaking song, no more mismatched shoes, no more rituals to fumble through, or old women staring with oddly specific expectations. You're alone now, just you, a scratchy woolen blanket, and perhaps a strange sense of peace beneath it all. Because even under layers of custom and chaos, there was always the hope that love somehow might bloom in the middle of this historical carnival. And if not love, at least a quiet night's sleep. You made it. Through the bread, through the frog, through the boots in bed. So close your eyes now. Traveler, let the wedding drums fade. Sleep well. Now, we wake up in a place where the walls don't echo, they absorb. A prison cell in 13th century Bologna. Italy? It smells like wet rope, regret, and soup that's been dreaming of vegetables for 3 days. You sit on a straw mat, feet chained, mouth dry, and mind replaying the same thought over and over. They're going to hang me before market day. Until the guard appears and says, "Get up. You're getting married." You would never think that a death sentence could be commuted with a wedding. But here we are, apparently. All it takes to erase your crimes: petty theft, accidental arson. Mild stabbing is a willing bride and a priest who can show up on time. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. You're shuffled out of the cell with your best attempt at dignity, which is hard when you've got one shoe and your formal tunic is just the less stained one. The guards are oddly helpful. One even brushes straw off your shoulder. Executioners rarely get involved in wardrobe prep, but today is different. Today, you're not being led to the gallows. You're being led to the altar. Someone hands you a document, your criminal record, neatly summarized and blessed by a notary who probably stopped reading halfway through. But at the bottom, in fresh ink, it reads, "Marriage pending, execution delayed." The ink glows like a miracle. Historians still argue how widespread this legal loophole was, but records from several Italian city-states, Bologna, Florence, Siena, confirmed that marrying a condemned man could suspend or even cancel his punishment. It wasn't mercy, it was paperwork, and occasionally, romance unlikely, but not impossible. The bride hasn't arrived yet. You don't know her name. You don't know what she's been promised or threatened with. You just know she exists. And she said yes. Probably. Maybe. Hopefully. A friar nearby is mumbling a blessing while eyeing you like a failed experiment. You wait in the back of a butcher's shop. The church was busy with a more legitimate wedding. Yours, meanwhile, will take place under a hanging pig carcass and a string of garlic. Symbolism, not ideal, but it's dry, and it counts. The bride walks in. She's wearing a simple dress and the expression of someone who has either made peace with the absurdity of the world or lost a bet. She glances at you. You nod. Chained foot extended slightly, like a nervous bachelor at a medieval mixer. She nods back. The friar clears his throat, and somehow it begins. No choir, no dubs, just two people, a contract, and the faint smell of meat in the background. When he says, "Speak now or forever hold your peace," no one speaks. Mostly because the guards look like they really want this to work. And when it's done, when the words are spoken, the vows barely whispered, and the ink dried on your name, the friar stamps the parchment and mutters, "By God and law, you may go home." The chains come off. You don't cry. Not yet. You just hold your new wife's hand like it might dissolve. The pigs keep swinging overhead, but for now, at least, your neck is safe. You step outside the butcher's stall into the sharp, sun-drenched cobblestones of Bologna, and it hits you. You are no longer a prisoner. You are a husband, legally married, socially confusing, and functionally free, though possibly only in the geographical sense. The guards melt back into the crowd like your crime never happened. A friar slips you a roll and says, "Mazel tov," even though he's not entirely sure what language that is. And your bride, she's already walking 2 steps ahead, either in deep thought or attempting to avoid further eye contact. You would never think get married or die was once a functioning piece of civic law. But in 13th century Italy, it absolutely was, particularly in city-states like Bologna, Florence, and even parts of Venice. Local councils developed a delightfully absurd idea: capital punishment could be overturned by marriage, provided the condemned man was willing to behave and the bride was willing to gamble. The logic, if you squint at it long enough, starts to make sense. Cities were overcrowded, executions were expensive and messy, and public image mattered. Reform was trendy, especially if it involved paperwork. So marry a woman of good standing, she agrees. The state agrees. And suddenly, your crimes are forgiven, or at least postponed until your next public tantrum. Marriage became a legal eraser. A very awkward, emotionally complicated, socially pressurized eraser. Historians still argue whether this practice was driven by genuine reformist intent or a creative method for population control. Some councils even used it as a way to clean up the streets and boost marriage rates simultaneously. One 1263 ordinance in Florence reportedly offered a tax incentive to women who agreed to marry a man of unfortunate judicial entanglement. A fringe scholar once described it as romanticized penal diplomacy. Another called it state-sponsored matchmaking for men with bad impulse control. Either way, it works sometimes. You and your bride walk in silence through a narrow alley that smells like wet parchment and roasted chestnuts. A neighbor peeks out a window and gasps. Word spreads, fast in cities, where gossip has better boots than the mailman. She finally turns to you and says, "What did you do?" You pause. You consider. You say. It was mostly misunderstood sheep relocation. She doesn't laugh, but she doesn't leave either. Later that day, a clerk stamps your marriage certificate with a wax seal shaped like a lion. He gives you a look that says, "Don't mess this up, or we both go down." You are now married in the eyes of God, the city, and most importantly, the bailiff. At night, you sleep on a pallet beside a woman you just met. In a borrowed room that smells like hay and nerves, you listen to the silence and realize it's the first silence in weeks that doesn't end in the sound of keys. You're not innocent, but now you're legal. And in 13th century Italy, that's practically the same thing. The morning after, your legally sponsored salvation smells like damp bread, nervous glances, and the faint panic of someone who just realized they married a stranger to avoid the gallows. You sit at a tiny wooden table with your new wife, who is currently deciding whether you're more of a fixer-upper or a municipal mistake. She chews slowly. You smile awkwardly. The silence between bites is legally binding. You would never think marriage could replace a death sentence. But the economics of 13th century Italy make some very strange things not only possible, but financially preferable. Executions are expensive. Trials are messier than you'd think. And having a living, married ex-criminal contributing taxes, that's pure civic efficiency. City-states like Bologna, Siena, and Padua ran on laws, ledgers, and loopholes. And somewhere between no stabbing and please stop stealing goats, someone scribbled a clause: if he marries a respectable woman, we'll pretend he didn't do it. So councils begin to offer incentives. A few cities even maintain informal redemption rosters, basically matchmaking lists, but with more moral anxiety and less wine. In some towns, a woman who marries a condemned man might receive a small dowry from the city treasury, exemption from certain taxes, a chicken, and, in one case, a gently used donkey romance is dead, but civic math is thriving. Historians still argue whether this system was an act of progressive mercy or just bureaucratic thrift. One record from Perugia shows a baker who married a man accused of theft and was immediately forgiven 2 years of flour tax. Another woman reportedly received a leather apron, 3 onions, and a signed pardon for her husband, who had a charming disposition and one fewer ear than usual. Your wife, however, appears to have received no such bonus. Just you. And whatever lingering questions you've wrapped in a tunic and a forced smile. You ask her gently, "Why did you say yes?" She shrugs, then says, "The priest told me you were quiet and had all your teeth." You nod. That is, technically, true. By midday, your legal reintegration begins. You meet with a city clerk who checks your name off the pending execution ledger and moves you onto the conditional redemption list. You are given a parchment copy of your marriage certificate and a list of approved professions. Goat herder is on there. Executioner is not. Probably for the best. Some of your fellow former inmates didn't make it to marriage. One fainted before the altar. One shouted, "Run halfway through the vows." And one, unfortunately, tried to marry 2 brides at once. He is now very single and slightly shorter. You spend the afternoon learning how to make candles, because apparently you need a job and former criminal doesn't sell well at the market. Your wife watches. She doesn't comment. But that night, she brings bread, soft, still warm. You think, maybe not all loopholes are terrible. You wake up the next morning with wax under your fingernails and the slow realization that candle making is both more difficult and more existential than expected. There's something humbling about trying to prove your worth through congealed fat and patience. You dip, you wait, you dip again. Congratulations, you're now a metaphor for yourself. Your wife is gone before sunrise. She's gone to the market or run away. It's unclear. You chew a hunk of bread and stare at the ceiling. No gallows, no priest, no guards, just married to a stranger who may or may not return with eggs. You would never think that a criminal's redemption would rest on beeswax and breakfast. But here you are. Medieval Italy's version of therapy is hard labor, inconsistent affection, and a legal framework that basically shrugs and says, "We'll see how it goes." By mid-morning, a neighbor knocks. She's ancient, possibly made of dust and disapproval. She eyes you with the solemn precision of someone judging both your soul and your boots. You're the one who stole bread, she says. You nod. She squints. Married now? You nod again. She sighs and hands you a chicken, apparently. Some townspeople participate in what can only be described as rehabilitative gifting. Once a criminal has legally married, neighbors offer symbolic items to help the new couple begin a better life. Eggs, bread, a broom. One guy once received a live eel, unclear whether that was support or sabotage. Historians still argue whether these neighborly gestures were rooted in Christian charity or just a practical effort to keep newly reformed people from stealing their stuff again. You try to express gratitude. The old woman interrupts. "Don't ruin her life," she says, then walks away. Midday passes with a visit to the city registrar. They check that you are, in fact, still alive and not causing any scandals. They then note in the margins of your file, no longer a public threat. Mild candle potential. Progress. You return home with your chicken, who is not named, because you know better than to emotionally invest in livestock. Your wife returns with 2 carrots and a look that says, "I see you still exist," which is technically affection. In this context, that evening, you eat soup. It tastes like vegetables that had bigger dreams, but it's warm, and no one yells. Afterward, she asks what crime you committed. You pause. Tell her the truth. She listens, then says, "You still have all your teeth?" You nod. She nods back. And just like that, you pass the first real test of marriage in 13th century Italy, mutual tolerance through teeth-based diplomacy. The chicken watches this unfold. You think it's judging you. Later, while sweeping, you find a discarded parchment scrap by the door. It's a note from a clerk. It says, "Successful redemption case. Continue observation." You didn't realize you were still being watched. You wonder who else is watching. The priest, the council, the man who gave you the chicken. You close the door, gently, and realize your freedom might depend on soup. Smiles. And staying boring. The next morning, you learn the chicken lays eggs. 2. In fact, she does it smugly, as if she knows she's now contributing more to the household than you. Your wife names her Beatrice. You try not to feel replaced. You step outside to draw water. The well smells faintly like regret and mildew. A neighbor waves at you, then points. Behind him, a teenager is holding a wooden sign that reads, "Thief-turned-husband lives here." The ink is still wet, apparently, in your town. Public notice doesn't just mean informing the village. It also means mildly humiliating you every time someone walks by. The sign is part of your ongoing redemption narrative, which is a fancy way of saying you're not in prison, but don't get too comfortable. Historians still argue whether this practice of labeling reformed criminals was genuinely about rehabilitation or simply a medieval hobby akin to gossip. But with woodcraft, you take down the sign. The boy puts up another. You chase him. He runs like someone who's definitely never stolen bread. Eventually, a clerk arrives from the city records. He wants to inspect your living arrangement. You open the door and gesture toward the tidy chaos inside. 1 chicken, 2 chairs, half a loaf of bread, and the vaguest hint of domestic cooperation. He nods, makes a note, sniffs your soup pot. "Vegetables," he murmurs. "Promising?" You're now officially classified as low risk of recidivism. Congratulations. You've leveled up in the grand video game of not being executed. But the real trial arrives that night. Your wife's cousin drops by. He smells like onions and confidence. He also used to be a city guard. He eyes you like you're the world's most suspicious candle. "I heard you married her," he says, smiling without his eyes. "I did," you answer, trying not to blink too aggressively. "She could have done worse," he adds. "Like that guy who tried to marry his goat." You nod, unsure if that's meant as encouragement or a veiled threat. The evening descends into awkward stew and polite silences. Your wife says little. Her cousin says a lot, mostly about how dangerous criminals are, and how his sword is mostly decorative now, but still sharp in a pinch. By the time he leaves, you've lost all feeling in your upper back and gained a new respect for emotional endurance. You think about your bed, thin mattress, lumpy blanket, probably haunted by old tax documents, but it's your bed. You lie awake, wondering how many people still think you're faking this marriage, wondering how many are just waiting for you to fail. Then, faintly, you hear laughter. Your wife, chuckling at something Beatrice has done. Apparently, the chicken is now sleeping in your seat. You smile in the dark. It's small. It's absurd, but it's a start. You roll over and think. You would never think surviving a death sentence would come down to poultry, soup, and strategic silence. But here we are. You wake up to the smell of cabbage and wood smoke. It's not romantic, but it's distinctly alive, which, considering your recent brush with execution, feels like a personal victory. You stretch, step around the chicken, and stub your toe on a misplaced bucket. Beatrice clucks judgmentally. Today, you're due for a civic contribution. As part of your community redemption package, a phrase that sounds suspiciously like corporate branding, you've been volunteered to assist with bridge repairs. Not build a bridge. Mind you, just carry stones from one end of the field to the other, while a carpenter yells instructions and never lifts anything heavier than his sarcasm. You trudge to the site, greeted by other unfortunate souls. One man tried to sell fake relics to pilgrims. Another was caught impersonating a priest. Together, you form a ragtag squad of It Was Just One Time Club. A civic warden watches from a stool, sipping ale. Good form. He says every time you lift a rock. You try not to respond with "I used to steal for a living," not cross-train. Historians still argue whether these labor assignments genuinely helped reintegrate criminals or just provided free muscle for infrastructure projects no one else wanted to do. Either way, the bridge is getting rebuilt, one rock and sore back at a time. During the lunch break, a child approaches you. She's maybe 6, missing a front tooth, and holding a slightly bruised apple. "Are you the man who married to not die?" she asks, with the bluntness only children possess. You nod slowly. She hands you the apple. "My grandma says that's clever." You take it like it's gold. Because in that moment, it is. Back home, your wife is sewing. Not your clothes. Those are still beyond hope. But something new. A curtain. For privacy. For something resembling dignity. You help hang it. Awkwardly poking a finger, with a splinter in the process. She laughs. Genuinely this time. Beatrice flutters by, triumphant with another egg. That night, the two of you sit in silence. Not awkward this time, just tired, in the way people are when they've both worked all day without collapsing. Your wife finally speaks. You are almost hanged. You nod. I was almost a lot of things. She glances over. You're not a monster. You don't answer. But you do notice that she no longer moves her things away from your side of the table. That small shift feels bigger than any bridge you just helped build. In the distance, church bells ring. Not for a wedding, not for a funeral, just the usual reminder that time, like judgment, is always ticking. You think about your new role, not prisoner, not husband in any romantic sense, but something stranger, a symbol of justice gone oddly domestic, a case study in marital rehabilitation. You lean back and think, you would never think love would enter through the kitchen door, followed by a chicken and a curtain. But here we are. You wake up to quiet. No gallows, no glares, no immediate chores demanding your resurrection. Just the sound of wind nudging the shutters and Beatrice softly clucking in her sleep, which is somehow more dignified than your own snoring. The honeymoon period, if one could call it that, has entered a curious phase. You and your wife have stopped tiptoeing and started coexisting. She doesn't flinch when you enter the room anymore. And you've stopped mentally rehearsing escape plans involving the firewood pile and a tunnel that doesn't exist. This morning, she asks if you'll fetch water. You would never think that being sent to collect water could feel like a gesture of trust. But here we are. The bucket's cracked. The well is half a mile away, and your boots still smell like week-old soup. But you carry the bucket anyway. And she doesn't check it when you return. That feels oddly romantic. Overheard gossip in the village square makes you pause. Apparently. Another man tried the marriage gambit last week. Unlike you. He failed to convince anyone he was worth the rope or the vow. He's now scrubbing chamber pots at the monastery. You silently toast your survival with stale bread. Historians still argue whether marriage as a legal loophole was a relic of mercy, a manipulation of canon law, or simply a bureaucratic oddity with an unusually high risk of emotional fallout. Either way, you're living proof that love, or at least domestic neutrality, might be more rehabilitating than punishment. Later, a magistrate visits. His robes are less pristine than before, as if dealing with you has aged him. He asks routine questions. Are you working? Yes. I moved approximately 400 rocks last Thursday. Is the marriage stable? She only throws spoons now, not knives. Any intention to flee? You glance toward Beatrice. She'd follow me. And she bites. He notes something down and leaves with the expression of a man who just had to inspect a goat for moral fiber. One quirky tidbit emerges that evening as you help salt fish in the back room. Your wife, without looking up, mutters, "You snore like my uncle." You freeze. "Is that bad, you ask?" "He lived to 80, she replies, "mostly by scaring away bears." Progress. You'd count that as progress. Dinner is salted fish and lentils. You eat in companionable silence, interrupted only when Beatrice steals a piece of fish, flutters to the rafters, and drops it on your head. She is, evidently, not on board with peace talks. That night, you sit outside, watching stars through the holes in the thatched roof. You think about your strange new life. Not quite punished, not quite forgiven, just adjusted. You wonder if this is what freedom tastes like: dry lentils, shared silence, and the possibility that you're no longer simply surviving your sentence, but inhabiting it. You lie down, letting the sounds of the night fold over you like a moth-bitten blanket. And for once, you fall asleep without rehearsing your next defense. You wake up thinking someone is choking you. Turns out, it's just Beatrice sitting on your chest again, a feather to the mouth, and two talons pressing on your ribcage, her loving way of saying rise and shine. She's no rooster, but she's punctual. By now, you've settled into something resembling a routine. You chop wood badly, you fetch water slowly, you occasionally help mend nets, and once a week, you try to scrub your tunic until the stains become part of its aesthetic. Domestic life is basically a sequence of awkward gestures softened by the passage of time and fish scales. You and Beatrice's owner, sorry, your wife, are still married in the legal sense. Emotionally, it's a more flexible arrangement. You speak more now. Mostly short phrases like, "It's boiling over. That's my boot." And no, I'm not running away, I'm just weeding. One mainstream historical fact. In 13th century Italian communes, local courts often allowed clerics and minor nobles to issue alternative sentences in minor or ambiguous cases. Marrying the victim, or their sibling, or even the baker's daughter, if sufficiently dramatic, could satisfy a sense of restitution in communities where formal prisons were expensive, rare, and often unhygienic enough to be death sentences on their own. This morning, Beatrice's owner/wife hands you a spoon. Not to eat, to stir. She's making onion soup and doesn't trust the fire. You stir dutifully while she skins something that may once have been a rabbit, or a very confused cat. In the corner of the room is a carved chest you've never opened. It sits there like a mystery box in a medieval escape room. She notices your glance and says, "It was my mother's." And just like that, you realize you know almost nothing about this woman you married to avoid the hangman. Not her mother's name, not her favorite food, not even whether she actually believes in God or just fears her local priest's eyebrows. One quirky tidbit. Some 13th century marriage records in Florence show ceremonies performed over prison bars. Yes, truly men in shackles saying "I do" to women in veils, with guards acting as witnesses and birds occasionally pooping on the officiant. Historians still argue whether these kinds of marriages were rooted in genuine community rehabilitation strategies, gender power balances, or simply chaotic convenience. You're inclined to vote for chaotic convenience, with a side of "nobody thought this through"? Later, she brings you a blanket. Not a new one, just the one she normally uses. But she drapes it over your shoulders while you're sitting outside, staring at the moon like it owes you an explanation. No words, just the blanket, and a pause that doesn't need commentary. You want to say something profound, like, "Thank you," or "I'm sorry for stealing your spoon that first night." But you just nod. She nods back. That night, as you lie beneath patchy wool in Beatrice's judgmental gaze, it occurs to you that the rope you once feared has been replaced by threads, soft, fragile, and occasionally itchy, but still holding something together. You sleep more easily now. Not because the straw's gotten softer, it hasn't, but because you've stopped bracing for the ceiling to collapse or the law to change its mind. Fear has become a background hum, like the sound of Beatrice pecking wood in her sleep. This morning, you don't wake up to her claws. You wake up to the smell of warm bread. Your wife, still your wife, somehow has baked for the first time since the wedding. She doesn't say anything about it, just slices off a chunk, hands it to you, and resumes sweeping. You don't say anything either, but you eat every crumb. One mainstream fact in 13th century Italy: bread wasn't just food, it was survival, politics, and proof of stability. Bakers were respected members of society, and being offered bread in the home, especially handmade and warm, was a quiet gesture of trust, a miniature peace treaty in crust form. You head into town to deliver dried herbs. On the way, someone you recognize from your former life spots you. They hesitate, then call out. Married life suits you. You raise the herb basket in salute, trying not to look like someone who once nearly choked on fear. Inside the market, a man is arguing with a magistrate. He wants his brother freed on a marriage plea. The magistrate, a different one than yours, simply says, "We're not doing that anymore." You feel it like a drop stone in your stomach. The loophole, it seems, has closed. Historians still argue whether this kind of legal leniency empowered communities or simply gave too much discretion to men in robes with bad tempers and unwashed hands. Either way, you slip through at the last possible moment. By the time you return, Beatrice has dragged your pillow into the firewood pile. Again, your wife just shrugs. You both laugh. One quirky tidbit: some later legal codes in Italian city-states specifically forbade marriage to evade corporal punishment, which means, of course, it had become a trend. Apparently, medieval law wasn't immune to social fads. That night, you sit on the step, chewing old cheese and listening to frogs announce their existence to the moon. You think about rope and choices and the astonishing weirdness of being alive because someone once said "I do" while glaring at you. The house is quiet. The stars blur. And you think, absurdly, that you wouldn't trade this life for anything, not even your old one, not even freedom. Not because you've fallen in love, not quite, but because survival, over time, becomes something you carry gently, like a cracked jug of water, like a chicken that insists on sleeping on your chest. And so you lie back, arms folded behind your head, and let the evening drift around you like a shawl. No alarms, no sentences, no dramatic conclusions, just the ordinary miracle of being spared, and the quiet certainty that, for once, you won't need to run in your sleep.